Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a registered psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada. And this is actually my 6th episode. And the topic for this episode is mindfulness. And I'm really pleased to have a guest here with me this evening, Carl Legault. He's a psychotherapist and much more versed in mindfulness than I am. So I'm happy he's here with me. And I'm going to just pass this over to Carl right now so he can just maybe tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do, and then tell us what mindfulness is from your perspective.
Great. Well, first of all, Jim, it's an honor to be back on the podcast for the 2nd time. That's my record, by the way. Actually, this is the only podcast I've ever been on. So but yeah, so I'm Carl Legault. I'm a registered psychotherapist. I also teach at Durham College in 2 programs, addictions and mental health, and the social service worker program. I teach kind of psychotherapy and counseling, and a lot of my teaching centers around what we're going to be talking about today. So mindfulness-based interventions and how they help people who struggle in particular with addiction, but more broadly with mental health concerns and what we might call psychosocial concerns. So like the intersection of psychological issues and social issues, and helping people to adapt to their lived situations. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Great. So what, well, maybe I'll start off with just describing mindfulness. So I guess the fellow that is sort of considered to be the person that sort of started mindfulness here in North America would be, unless I'm mistaken, Jon Kabat-Zinn. So he was maybe one of the founding people that sort of made it more popular here. And he had a description of it that I thought was, I would share, which is he would describe mindfulness as paying attention on purpose, non-judgmentally. And he has this little thing he adds to it, which I guess is funny, is as if your life depends on it. So I don't know what that means, but
which of course it does, as he adds.
Yeah. So
yeah.
But and another thing he refers to it about is it's like, because we were just talking about this before. It's not an approach, it's not a model, it's not a strategy. It's a mindful way of living. It's a way of living. So how would you describe mindfulness, Carl?
Well, that's a great way to get started. I mean, Jon Kabat-Zinn is absolutely a great place to get started. But I wouldn't depart very much from that definition at all. I mean, not to get things too kind of complicated and multi-layered from the get-go, but I would say there are 3 ways that I introduce mindfulness to people. And like they kind of start from the most scientific and rigorous, where, and again, it makes it sound more complicated than it's going to be. I basically describe mindfulness to most people as a systematic first person. So you're doing it yourself, okay, on your own, even if you're doing it in a context that's social and it's kind of guided, but it's a systematic first person attempt to regulate your attention in a really directed and intentional way, not attentional, but intentional way. That's part of Kabat-Zinn's definition that really resonates with me. Why do we do it on purpose? Because as we might get into in more detail soon, this is completely contrary to the natural tendency of the human mind. We don't pay attention intentionally and non-judgmentally. We'll get back to what that means later, but the natural tendency of the human mind is to be kind of caught up in this automatic and mindless, in other words, non-attentional mode of being, where we're just kind of going from one thing to another and kind of getting caught up in our own thoughts and forgetting that our thoughts are just thoughts, right? They're not truths. They're not facts. They're just things that get created by our minds. So I start there, and then I go to something like Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition. And then I get to like a deeper, what you might call like a practical, existential, and even spiritual definition of mindfulness. And to me, mindfulness in that sense is simply teaching yourself to more effectively show up for each moment of your life, in each moment, right? And what I mean by show up is to really be there, to not be half there, to not be kind of, multitasking or dividing your attention, right? When I'm hugging my daughter, I want to really show up for that hug. I want to be there. I want my attention to be narrowed in like a beam on a flashlight as precisely as I can. I don't want to be thinking about my to-do list for tomorrow. I want to show up for the moments in my life and the people in my life that I really care about. And to be honest, Jim, this is where I'll kind of, end my little monologue. That is how I, sell people on the concept of mindfulness. We can talk about all the studies and the evidence about how mindfulness helps with this and that and the neurological stuff. That's great. But to me, I don't even care in a way if mindfulness, and especially mindfulness meditation, doesn't end up, having a strong evidence base, which it does, which is cool. But even if it didn't, I know from personal experience that it helps me to better show up for the people and the moments in my life that matter. And that is why I care about it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think these days more important even than it used to be, because with phones, with a lot of the, the distractions we have, which maybe 100 years ago they didn't have to the same degree. It's, it's one of the things I worry about right now with parents and stuff. When you see kids in the playground, the parents are sitting on the bench and they're on their phone and kids falling down and they don't even notice, and those types of things. So, but I think I think the thing that's important for people to understand is the reason that it goes against a lot of our innate sort of functioning in nature to sort of, because we do a lot of things automatically without thinking. That's just how our body works and mind works. And we typically judge things to see if they're going to harm us or if it's safe and those kind of things, which makes sense. But it's almost like we've taken that and we've magnified it to a point where it's ridiculous, where we're analyzing and judging every little thing. And as the video I was watching, John Kabat-Zinn was talking about, we're usually to the negative. We're like, you had a conversation with someone and the person glanced away and I'm like, does Carl not like me? And, these kinds of things. And it's just like this constant sort of focus on like judging and often ending up with this like negative, like ending up in a sort of negative rumination about it. So I mean, I think the thing for me that was really key was to be able to stop and be present and observe, but not judge, not struck on this word, non-judgmentally. So it's that was the key part, because I'm used to observing, of course, but I'm used to then, is this good? Is this bad? Is this right? Is this wrong? Is this okay? Is this not okay? And to suspending that, I think for me is what's so freeing, because I'm fully present and observing and just accepting what is. And this is, of course, a very, very powerful kind of Zen concept where I'm just, something isn't good or bad. It's just, it is, right? It is what it is. And I guess I was listening the other day to a quote from Buddha that said that I forget the exact wording, but basically desire is the root of all suffering. So the pursuit of, I guess, desire is the root of suffering. Mm-hmm. And if we were to not desire things, but for most of us, that's like so far beyond where we presently are that it's hard to kind of grasp the idea of living a life where we didn't want for anything, didn't desire anything. So, but it's just, I think for people, there's a course that I have coming out on mindfulness that one of the exercises we do in it is, the first exercise we do is kind of just called Just Be. So we have people just sit for a minute and just be and observe. And just what kind of thoughts come to you, you're not necessarily just spend that time. And afterwards, just kind of write down what are some things that happened. And just to kind of begin that step towards just observing. What did I just was going to ask you, because you do a lot more with mindfulness with clients than I do, Carl. What is the area that you find Is there an area that challenges them? Is there an area where they struggle or they push back a bit?
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'd like to just kind of quickly kind of pivot from what you just said there and then get to some of those challenges. In fact, it nicely dovetails with it. I love the emphasis that you have there on kind of like the non-judgmental kind of essence of mindfulness, right? The idea is not, because as you correctly pointed out, our minds are these judgment machines, right? I mean, more generally, they're thought machines, but a lot of those thoughts, I liken them to having on board this, this kind of like internal narrator. Some people call it the inner critic. Steve Hayes calls it the dictator within. It's like this person that lives inside of you that chases you out of bed every morning and that beats you into unconsciousness, finally releases you from its judgment. It's constantly talking to you all day. It's constantly evaluating everything in your environment. It's judging, right? Yeah. It's evaluating. And judging doesn't always mean bad, by the way. It doesn't mean ugly or terrible or you're bad. Judging can be appraisals of goodness, of utility, of meaning, right? Non-judgmental doesn't mean never have judgments. Mindfulness will not prevent you from having judgments. Mindfulness instead allows you to kind of, to use an analogy with a car here, it allows you to lift open the hood and to have a look at the thoughts that are arising in your head, well, more specifically in consciousness, and to not get carried away by them. In other words, to not put a second layer of judgment on top of the first judgment itself. So Buddhists, it's funny you mentioned this, the Buddha had a kind of parable here called the second arrow. The first arrow you can't avoid. That's just judgment itself. It comes up in each moment. You can't stop it. The second arrow is the totally unnecessary additional judgment. Like I just think to myself, oh, I'm kind of crappy. That's the first arrow. The second arrow is, oh my God, why am I always thinking that I'm crappy? Here's a third arrow. Oh man, why am I constantly ruminating about the fact that I'm thinking about that I'm crazy? That's what the ideal of mindfulness is trying to help people to cultivate. It's not being free of judgments. It's being aware of your judgments and knowing what to do with them. Yeah. So here's how this nicely transitions into your question, like, where do people struggle the most with this? Okay, well, that's one big area already. Okay. So that's one kind of myth I have to kind of, disabuse people of already, is like, no. We're not telling you not to have judgments. That's impossible, right? It's about what you do with your judgments. I would say, Jim, the number one kind of challenge that people have, and it's within the first 20 seconds that anyone tries to meditate with me, right? Or even, tries any kind of mindfulness-based exercise where I ask them, say to focus on some kind of object of attention. For most people, they start with the breath or like a sensation in the body, or, even just focus on sounds, whatever it is. What they notice, like everyone will when you do this, is that you immediately get knocked off. Just whatever you were focusing on, you get knocked off that object and your mind starts to wander, right? And it starts to think of your to-do lists. It starts to think of memories. Images pop up. What's for dinner? Oh, should I really make that? Oh, I should start thinking better about my weight and how I'm eating. And it starts, and then you clue into that and you go, oh my God, what was I doing? I'm supposed to be focusing on the breath like Carl told me. And my clients will say, Carl, I can't meditate because my mind won't stop thinking. I have too many thoughts. And I just want to kind of grab them by the shoulders and say, this is exactly what the practice is about. So this is my final way of introducing what mindfulness practice is. That experience of being kind of thrown away by your thoughts, right? Of being knocked off the object of attention. That's what mindfulness is. It's noticing in each moment what's actually happening in your experience. Specifically in this case, noticing in each moment the thoughts that are arising. It's waking up in each moment from what I call the dream of being lost in thought. because that's the condition that we're in most of the time.
Yeah.
So far from being a failure, it's actually a sign that you're doing it right. If you're noticing in each moment, right?
Yeah.
That's me snapping my fingers to kind of indicate each time you notice. Every time you notice, that's a moment that you're waking up mindfully to what's actually happening in your experience. You're not asleep, right?
Yeah.
But that's the biggest one. That's a good place to get us started.
That's a good point, because that's the one where I think the issue with that is the issue in general with a lot of things is that, of course, it's going to happen, but it's not so much that it's happening, it's that they've been attacking with this judgment that not only am I not doing this right the way, Carl or Jim have told me to do, but adding to that, I can't do this.
I can't do
and
it.
Then feeling, awful about themselves or more down, that here's one more thing I can't do properly. And then going on to that. So then, and no wonder then they say, as you hear all the time, I can't do this. And so it's funny because you were just, as you were mentioning, I realized that earlier today when I was meditating, and I've gotten a lot better at this lately, is I was doing, I think, a 10-minute meditation, and probably for like 2 minutes, I went into I slipped into this old thought about a person I used to know. And it was very intense, and I was thinking about it very deeply. And then I realized I was, what was happening, but I was doing for quite a while. And then I just went back to the meditation, and I wasn't upset with myself. Didn't really bother me. And that was in like, it happened, but it doesn't have to matter. It's just, I continued with the meditation. I felt great afterwards, and it was irrelevant. And so ideally, that's what I tell people, like, just, like you said, you're noticing and that, but just, that's what you're supposed to be doing. It's just, observing. And if something pops in your head, and, just let it drift on by or something. But I think it sort of helps people if they can grasp it, that this is exactly why this is important. Is you're kind of like, you're trying something new, you're jumping on yourself, saying you can't do it right, and then you're abandoning it. So, and it's certainly, that's something I think that happens a lot in people's lives, so.
Absolutely. The second major thing that comes up as a challenge for people, and you may have heard this one before too, Jim, is this idea that, hey, I'm not able to meditate, Carl, because I'm not clearing my mind.
Yeah.
I'm not noticing. I mean, like, okay, fine, I get it. Maybe not the first 30 seconds, the first 3 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, but come on, after about 20 minutes of doing this, shouldn't I achieve this kind of state of, just psychological emptiness, right? And this is understandable because this is a myth that's kind of perpetuated in, popular culture. And it's even perpetuated in some martial arts that are otherwise just beautiful and highly respectable. This idea that I have to have a clear mind. And if it's meant by that, right, literally that you should no longer have any thoughts in your mind, what I tell people kind of tongue in cheek is, well, that's only going to happen at brain death, right?
Yeah, true.
Right. Brain death is the only time that you're not going to have thoughts. Otherwise, like everyone else, you're going to have you're going to have a mind that is just teeming with thoughts, a constantly active, just thought generating machine. And that's not a sign of illness, right? That's not a sign of dysfunction, right? No. I find this is really empowering once you hammer this point home with people. It's not a sign that you're weird at all, right? It's a sign that you are just like everyone else. And the only difference between you and the folks who aren't doing a practice like this, who aren't deliberately kind of focusing in that narrow beam of attention, is that you're actually noticing what it's like to have a mind like that. And you're noticing its contents in each moment that you practice this. It doesn't make you weird. You're just noticing, I guess, the weird mind that we all share in some sense. Yeah.
No, it's a good point. And one of the things I noticed as I've been doing this more, and I must say in the last year, I've been doing this a lot more than I had in the past, is, and we know this from from other, research and stuff like that, that if we have a mindset of curiosity versus, judgment as well, like, you're open and curious and ideally maybe compassionate. But so when I would do a mindful walk or something and I would encounter different things, I would have this sort of, mindset of, interest and curiosity, which would be the opposite of judgment. I'm just trying to trying to understand and trying to observe and trying to see. And it's funny, like even if you go into this neighborhood I've been in for years, you can notice things that, a tree or a bird or so the other day I stopped and listened to a certain bird. And what I think if people can start doing that, what they can realize is you can find a lot of pleasure in your life from very basic, what we consider basic, simple things by just kind of simply observing and just kind of experiencing and ideally slowing down a bit to kind of be able to do that. So, and I think what I've realized myself too with my mindfulness practice or my meditation practice is in the last few months, I've actually gotten to a place where I can actually, when I used to sit and I kind of wonder, like, I think at times I was like, is time up yet? Or how much longer is this going to be and stuff like that. Right. So, and now I feel this, it's almost like, I think this is a strong term to say euphoria, but I'll feel this really kind of mild euphoria, like sensation as I kind of just focus inward and just be with myself. And I do find this kind of very peaceful, kind of enjoyable experience. Yeah. And when I start the meditation, it's very interesting because I have the same thought all the time. I'll start it. And as I start it, I'll have this thought, I should do this more often.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, which is great, but I don't necessarily do it multiple times a day, but I'll have this instead of where I think a few years ago, I'd have this like, is it 10 minutes yet or something like that pop in my head. Right. But I guess through practice, I've gotten to a place now where it's just, I'm really starting to enjoy it. It really gives me that where I can go from a very stressed place and a very kind of difficult place to really a very positive experience with just being with myself. And that's wonder. I mean, of course, anyone with the right, if you put the time into it, you could achieve that. But I don't think it's something that is easy for people to understand if they haven't experienced it. So,
what a lovely way to put that. In fact, that beautifully summarizes, in fact, in probably clearer, more concise terms, what I'm going to clumsily kind of make my way through this idea, this word you used of curiosity, right? Mm-hmm. To me, I call this the fourth option when I teach mindfulness to folks, like students and clients alike. So with regard to any experience, especially our own, right? Whether you look inward or whether it's, engaging with any object in the world, like food or another person, or I don't know, like some machine or device that we have. There are three primary tendencies that we tend to have, and it makes sense if you kind of map out the logical possibilities. The first one is that with respect to anything in our experience, we first either want more of it, right? We want to hang on to it for longer. We want it to increase in intensity, that could be really good food. That can be like the pleasures of a romantic relationship. That can be, I don't know, just getting a good massage, like whatever it is. Like we want more of it and we want to hang on to it for as long as we can. Right. Not just that superficial stuff, like chocolate and massages and making out with people, but it can also be, like the love that you share with your best friend or your children. You want it. You want to keep it. The second one is the polar opposite that we're all familiar with. Push it away. I don't want that. That's bad. I don't like it. It's useless. It's gross. It's ugly. I want to decrease its intensity, or I want to push it away or just inure myself from it. I don't want it in my life. The third option is a little more subtle, but it's a kind of like meh, I call it. It's a callous indifference. It's boredom. Meh, I don't care. Like I either want something, I don't want it, or I'm just boring. There's a fourth option, and it's lovely summarized by that word you just used. It's this kind of open curiosity. I don't have to want something and grab onto it, push it away, or express boredom or indifference. What if I just experience it exactly for what it is, with the kind of curiosity? I ask people to imagine almost like they're visiting an alien planet in the way that you almost described that experience with the birds. Like sure, you've been in that park or that neighborhood so many times, but imagine if you can enter into that space with fresh eyes and fresh ears, with real curiosity.
Yeah.
That's the fourth option. And that's why the way you put it was such a lovely way of kind of, more clearly and concisely summarizing what I take obviously too long to describe.
No, it's fine. Right. But one of the things about that, though, that's important is, and you see, there's a lot of different models in psychotherapy that will use curiosity. And what we know is that when you approach a person or yourself, I use it a lot with clients when they approach themselves. If you want to understand what's happening with yourself and you approach yourself with open curiosity and some compassion, you might learn something. But if you approach yourself with like the way the critical brain does, with this judgment, like, why'd you do that? Or what's wrong with you? Or why did you make that decision? You're not going to probably find anything out. So I think it's a sort of a truism that we know through, I guess not just psychology, but just well-being, that like if you're approaching with curiosity, you may end up with some information. If you're approaching with, and it's the same would be with therapy. If you had a therapist who was just asking questions and was judgmental, I mean, who's going to tell him anything? Who's even going to bother coming to see him? So I just think it's something that I know with a lot of my clients, when I want them to do the work on themselves, when they're asking, they're trying to like be curious, it's very helpful, because typically they would not be, they would be judgmental. But I think it's just a shift in how we are. It's something that I think people are not typically necessarily thinking about. But that's what our job, just sort of help them with this. Why not approach something with some curiosity? I mean, we would know, of course, with children that would be as well, too. If you want a small child to tell you something, you approach with interest and curiosity. What's that? That's amazing. Well, tell me what that is. And the child would be all beaming and share with you. You're like, what is that? What, obviously it's not. Child would probably shut down and you wouldn't get very far. So I think we do those things far too often without realizing. And but one of the things that of the mindfulness, there was, in terms of this, I was going to do a little plug about this course that I have that I'm offering in probably the next week or so at least. It's an 8-week course on mindfulness. It'll be an online course with some weekly support. But there's a number of different chapters that we address different things. We've talked about some of it: judgment, compassion, and there's one that I find quite challenging, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on it, which is and then we could probably be here for hours talking about it, but is the ego, and that's the one. I think it's the week 7 in the course, my take on the ego. I mean, there's many ways to look at the ego, but I tend to look at the ego as kind of like it's an embodiment of the kind of stories we tell ourselves about things. And I think mindfulness kind of looks at it that way. So it's not that it's true. These are I'm a great therapist. I'm a great dad. I'm this kind of person. These are the stories I tell myself. And I think the thing that I really like about mindfulness is that it gives people an opportunity, and we talk about this in my course, is to go below the story, to see what's there. And that, I know Eckhart Tolle was saying one time that below the story is vastness. And so for a lot of people that may not this be new to them, they're like, what are you guys talking about? But it's one of those things you just have to kind of try to spend some time observing and maybe meditating and going below the stories we tell ourselves to see what's really there. So, but what's your take on the ego, and is that something you address with clients?
Absolutely, Jim. And you're so right that we could take hours and hours on this topic alone. In fact, this is one of the main points, and I don't think I ever got around to mentioning it. Again, because of my own kind of chaotic monkey mind. It's my version of it, right? I don't think I got around to mentioning it during our first conversation on acceptance and commitment therapy and how it connects with mindfulness. But this is one of the key points of contact between mindfulness and acceptance and commitment therapy, or at least more generally, cognitive behavioral approaches in the third wave tradition, right? That have mindfulness kind of built into them. Now, in acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, okay, this is the distinction between what they call self as content, what you called like the storytelling self, right? The ego, right? The collection of ideas that I have about myself and expectations I have. But this is the kind of person I should be. This is who I really am. And if I'm not this person, then I'm failing in some way. It's all these stories that are, you know, like, some of them run really deep. Some of them are kind of way up at the level of, you know, surface awareness. But it's this complex web of, again, story is a good word for this. It's the stories we tell ourselves about who we really are, right? Again, scare quotes, really are. The self as context, on the other hand, okay, so there's self as content, that's the storytelling self. The self as context, sometimes called the observer self, is the self that's been stripped of those stories, at least in principle. Theoretically, it's really hard to, you know, separate. How do you do that with intangible things like stories that you're telling yourself in your mind? But it's the idea that when you strip away all of the things you tell yourself about who and what you are and what your, you know, what your destiny is, or whatever it is you say about yourself, all the roles that you assign to yourself, I'm this and I'm that and I'm the other thing, there's just consciousness, right? There's just awareness, right? There's awareness in particular, among other things, of all of those friggin' stories that you tell yourself, right? And mindfulness, the beauty of it, this is how I connect it. Mindfulness is a way of noticing, for some people, for the first time.
Good point.
Wow, look how often I tell myself this story about myself. Not in a direct way, by the way, Jim. It's not as if you notice a thought come up going, aha, this is Carl telling himself the story that he must always be on time for it doesn't show up like that. It's more like sometimes they show up in those statements that are talked a lot about in traditional CBT, like those should statements, right? Like shoulding on yourself, right? Like, you know, like, oh, I should be doing this. Well, if you really kind of dig into that statement, I should be doing this, that's usually part of a story of like the kind of person that you conceive yourself to be. So anyway, mindfulness is a way of connecting people to that ongoing set of stories that they're telling themselves, and it actually allows them to choose which ones they would like to identify with. None of those stories are necessarily who you are.
True. Yeah.
You can actually choose which ones you're going to identify with and which ones you're actually going to exemplify and manifest in your life.
Yeah.
Hope that wasn't too...
No, it makes sense, because with a lot of the clients that come to see me that are not feeling, that have a lot of good going on in their life, there's nothing so overtly wrong, but they don't feel fulfilled. I usually start with sort of getting their values, kind of focusing on what their values are, seeing how their values line up in their life. And then usually there's a big there's a big gap between what the priorities of their values are and where they are in their life. And so that's that kind of where they're not living their authentic self. They're living in some way that maybe other people have thought they should, or they just, this is what I'm supposed to do. And they're miserable because of that. So, but it's interesting about a lot of this stuff is that, you know, when we talk a lot about, you know, people being triggered and stuff like that, there's a lot of people out there that would, you know, look at the ego as like the, you know, if I look at myself as being a kind, compassionate person, and that's a story I tell myself. And then someone comes along and says, you were rude to me, Jim, you didn't treat me well. That could be the thing that conflicts with the story I tell myself. And that's where the trigger happens. How dare you speak to me that way? You don't know what you're talking about. Who are you to, like, I'm a wonderful guy. What do you mean? You know, and so this, and it might not be expressed, it's in my head, but it's like the ego then is triggered around this doesn't line up with the story. And then I guess, you get to the place of like kind of, acceptance and compassion and with mindfulness, and be like, well, this is just, this is their view. It doesn't, and it is what it is. Right. So, but, somebody has to be fairly evolved, but be fairly aware of themselves and feel fairly good about themselves to be able to take those things in stride. But I think that part, I was thinking about this the other day, that part of the course is probably going to be quite challenging for some people, and not challenging, but just into a lot of discussion, a lot of like trying to figure like, what do you mean by this? And stories we tell ourselves, what is that? So, but I think if you really look at it closely, in fact, it might even sort of rock some people in terms of like, oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way. It might kind of, shake them a bit to think, I just thought this was who I was, but maybe it's not who I am. Maybe I just, it's what I've told myself, the story I've told myself and stuff. So anyways, but it's, I think it's all part of the whole, just getting a sense of like becoming more aware of things that in some cases, a lot of us just don't even think about. Things we just live our life. We don't question things like this, but it's, but I think it's very helpful because especially for a lot of the people that we would work with, the stories they're telling themselves are not good stories. The stories they're telling themselves are causing distress and causing pain and causing tremendous amount of suffering. And typically what I find is these stories are not true anyway. So,
and that's the beauty of mindfulness right there. Like once you learn this really simple practice, I mean, like there are more and more complex, additions to the practice. I mean, once you start to get good at, fundamental noticing and concentration practice, sure, you can really expand this outward into like, compassion practice and, really complicated body scans. And it's really cool what you can do once you start with this fundamental toolkit, but just sticking with the fundamental, bare bones first skill that you learn, right? You learn to use your attention to notice what's actually going on in your head, right? In particular, you learn to notice thoughts arising in each moment. And like we just mentioned, a lot of those thoughts are stories that we tell ourselves. And it's not as if once you notice those thoughts and, oh, wow, that thought is just illusory, right? No, some of our thoughts are actually true. Some of our thoughts are close to the truth. Some of our thoughts are reasonable and plausible, but that's not the point of mindfulness. Mindfulness doesn't, arbitrate truth and falsity and plausibility or implausibility. Mindfulness just teaches you to see thoughts as thoughts, right? At that point, then you become, able to decide for yourself, hey, is this particular story that I'm telling myself, right, this thought, is this something that I want to exemplify in my life, right? Is this something that I actually want to live in accordance with? So it provides what's sometimes called, I think Russ Harris uses this language. It provides a choice point, right? Mindfulness is a lovely way of opening up a choice point between, like stimulus and response, right? You're able to kind of, slow the process down. Just because my mind offers up a story in this moment, it doesn't mean I have to act on it.
True.
Right? There's a space between those two things. And that is, to me, like the ultimate power of the practice is when you can put that into your life. It makes all the difference.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just reading that quote earlier today, between response and stimulus. And it was about something that Brené Brown is coming out with or something. She'd used that quote. But I think, I think it's just wonderful that, people can learn even to like, just because something, I don't have to act on it. I don't have to, kind of respond to it. Things will come and go, and we can just kind of observe, and we can kind of slow things down. We don't have to just react and jump on things. Oh my gosh, why is this happening? And, and so the amount of distress that some of my clients have with like even not being able to meditate is incredible. I feel almost bad suggesting it sometimes, because then they get so frustrated with themselves and they come back and they're this simple thing that everyone can do and I can't do it. It's just like, then we have to go through and kind of work through it. But I just, I know we said earlier, we could probably talk about this for like 6 hours, and it would be probably the longest podcast on record. But I wanted to just go quickly over, if someone is listening and has an interest in mindfulness, there's a lot of ways to get, as we've mentioned, to get started. But if somebody really wants to get a kind of, I'm offering this online course. It's going to be an 8-week course. I'll be, facilitating Zoom question and answer periods every week, and there'll be discussions groups and that. And it's going to just take you through from the very beginning, from the introduction to learning how to cultivate your attention, to gradually going through these as you mentioned the ego. The ego is towards the end, but really giving you like, and each week you'll have a workbook, and you have all these exercises to do. And it's going to be very directive in terms of like, do these exercises each day. And when you're making notes about what's, how you're experiencing it, that sort of thing. And then after the 8 weeks, and now it is a self-paced course, so you could take longer if you wanted, or less time. But I think after that, then somebody would really have a good familiarity and a good sort of a groundwork in experiencing, understanding mindfulness. And of course, one thing we didn't really talk that much about, but I want to just touch on, was just the vast amount of research that's come out about the benefits of mindfulness for, just about everything from pain to anxiety, depression, and even like a lot of physical ailments now and things like this, and just the general mental health and improvement in physical well-being. It's just, there's hundreds of studies. And so that's, as you said earlier, it's something that you experience yourself, that you find a lot of benefit in. But the fact that it is backed by research certainly makes it a lot easier to say to people, look, it's not just me, it's not just Carl. This has been sort of like duplicated, so many times. It's been, it's incredible. Like, I don't think there's, and so it's something we want people to, give it a try it out. If you're struggling with any of this stuff, it can't hurt to just sit and give it a try, So if someone is interested in this course, they're probably wherever the podcast is, there'll be a way to send me a message. But I also want to mention that I have my email that I typically use for the practice is jimsquire.counseling with 2 L's @gmail.com. And then I'm also on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube with the therapy_with_Jim. So, and that you can reach me that way too. And I'll be probably posting links and stuff. So, okay. So, any final thoughts there, Carl?
Well, first, not to make it sound like I'm, just shilling for my friend Jim, but I've actually had access to, Jim has shared with me the resources, especially for the mindfulness component of this course that he's talking about. And it looks fantastic. For someone like, I've been practicing mindfulness at least now for 16 years. I've been teaching it in some capacity for about 9 years. And as someone with that kind of experience, and again, it sounds like I'm totally shilling for my friend here, but it is legit. It is great material. In fact, I might even kind of give myself a little bit of a refresher, because Jim has done his homework. He has absolutely researched evidence-based ways of teaching and demonstrating these tools for anyone at any level. The one thing I would end with is perhaps kind of circling back to challenges that people might have with this stuff, is you don't need necessarily, and as you'll learn with Jim's course, okay, you don't need to make formal meditation practice to reap the benefits of mindfulness training. There are so many ways of practicing mindfulness, and I'll suggest just a couple as we're ending off in a moment. But I like to think of mindfulness. I used this analogy last time when I talked to Jim as like, I like to think of meditation as a kind of, gym training, right? Think of formal meditation as what, people who go to the gym and use, weights and, like specialized machines and really, kind of like sophisticated workouts to basically train muscles that they're going to, utilize in their everyday lives for the things they actually care about. If they're like me, they couldn't care any less about the intrinsic properties of, say, lifting a barbell, right, over their head and bringing it back down again. That is intrinsically useless unless you're a power lifter or a bodybuilder. Who cares about that? I do that, for example, okay, because I want to be able to lift my daughter up in the air, right? For as long as it's not awkward. Maybe by the time she's 13 or 14, she'll tell me, Dad, to stop, right? Meditation and mindfulness is the same, right? Meditation as a practice is really cool, okay? And it is a way of training the muscles that are, like the cognitive, the psychological muscles that are used in mindfulness. And that's what you use in your life. That's kind of like coming back to that first way that I put it earlier. Mindfulness is really about showing up to each moment of your life with as much attention as you can, right? And you're doing it on purpose because it's hard to do that. Our minds are not kind of designed to do that naturally. So if you don't have time to meditate, or if you want to prepare for a course like Jim's, I have something I suggest to people. Okay. So like before you take Jim's course and it gets really, kind of structured and you're being introduced to practices, I have something that I call transition practice. Okay. Or transitions. Take anything in your life that you're likely to do fairly often throughout the day and kind of consciously kind of imprint in your mind that this is going to be your thing. It's going to be your transition moment. It could be as simple as getting up from your office chair, or in my case, picking up a phone, right? Or just putting my hand on a door handle when I'm, leaving the house or coming back. It's a transition. You're going from one thing to another. And for that one activity, okay, we're not doing any complicated meditation. For that one activity, bring as much attention as you can to just the transition, just picking up that phone, putting your hand on the door handle, feeling what it's like to have a door handle making contact with your hand, looking down at your hand. Put as much attention as you can into that experience, and you'll know what it's like to show up to a moment. Okay. All that meditation stuff, all that fancy stuff is a way of just getting you better to do that practical showing up. So like I said, I couldn't recommend Jim's course any more highly. There's a lot of stuff out there that is called mindfulness, and there's a lot of duds out there. And again, Jim's my friend and my colleague, but
well, no, I appreciate that.
It's great. Yeah.
The other thing I would suggest, which is similar, was just that sometimes I suggest for people to start is a mindful walk. So, you just, all you have to do when you're walking to the store is just, instead of walking in the way you normally do, try to just observe everything. Observe how your feet feel touching the pavement, what the air feels on your face, whatever it is that's around you, even the clothing on your body as you move and stuff like that. So any of that stuff is a good way to just these are things you would almost always never pay any attention to, and they're completely irrelevant. And, and then that would be a good way to start. And there's another little exercise I'll mention just before we go, and that's commonly used in the mindfulness-based stress reduction courses as a first exercise, which is like it's mindful eating, where they get people to put a raisin in their mouth and just roll the raisin around. They don't eat it, but they just kind of roll it around. And notice the texture and what do you notice and what do you know, what are you aware of? And just, and there is a lot of people that practice mindful eating, which I think I wish I did. So probably my digestion would improve if I would eat slower, but there's a lot to be said for people that even, kind of mindfully experience their food as they're eating it. So like, really absorbing the taste and really focusing on it. And so there's so many ways you can start this, but you certainly don't need anything to start other than the willingness, I guess, to try it. But I think we've covered a lot of stuff for people here. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day, Carl. Do you want to just, for people that don't know, you want to just sort of mention again your practice and maybe how they could get a hold of you if they wanted to, say, work with you?
Yeah. So again, it's Carl Legault. So my practice is called Becoming You Counseling and Psychotherapy Services. I'm kind of an eclectic therapist, but I mainly operate within like the cognitive behavioral tradition, especially something known as ACT or acceptance and commitment therapy. And I've developed a bit of a presence on social media, but nothing too impressive. I'm on Instagram. I'll also be starting a podcast like Jim soon. And what I'll do is I'll share with Jim just all of my details and the ways you can contact me. I mainly focus on individual therapy, but I also work with couples and families. And I'm based out of Ajax, which is the Durham region. Many of my appointments are virtual right now, but I'll also be hosting in person in the near future.
Oh, good. Great. Yeah. Sounds awesome. So if everybody's looking for therapy, and right now it'd be, it's virtual, but it doesn't really matter where you're located, unless I guess you have to be, both of us have to work with people in Canada, but aside from that, you're, somebody could be listening to this anywhere, but so that's an option. So, well, I appreciate you coming by and spending some time here, Carl. It was very informative, and hopefully have you back.
It's been fantastic. Thanks, Jim.